Yeah, hi, everybody. I got a message from a dear old friend. Guy lives in Panama now. And he made a couple of comments that I want to follow up on. He said, "Man, you speak kindly of everyone, and that's so rare anymore." I didn't realize that. And then he said, "And I really like your discretion in that you aren't running out there going, I'm a star fucker. I want to hang around and associate with the biggest names." No, I've been too busy for one thing. Doesn't mean I don't appreciate the friendship and the acquaintances that I've been able to make, because it really has been the people. And on top of everything else that's made this career so rewarding, it's the people I've got to met. But the moment after he said, "Oh, it's great that you have this discretion, that you're not blowing up all of the 'I am a star fucker' deal," and then he says, "Talk about talk about Sir Paul McCartney." Okay, I will. Yeah. Wow, where do you begin? I could begin back with my girlfriend in high school freaking out over that band from Liverpool, the Beatles. And again, my first connection actually with them was when Robin Ford was hired by George Harrison to play in that band that had a bunch of Indian musicians, including Zakir Hussain on the tabla and all that. And his famous comment, pointing to the guitars behind him on the wall, going, "What we needed in the Beatles, Les Paul." Well, that's that's pretty funny, understated. Well, where Paul comes in is prior to the Wings tour. I don't know when that was. Some of you historians can pick up on that and tell me. But they loaded the whole band with Mesa Boogie gear, starting with our Bass 400, which gets me into the topic of bass amplifiers. Hey, I love bass amps and bass just as much. And the bass amps actually led us later on, decades later, into our adventure in high-end stereo, which several of you commenters have asked about. Talk about that a bit. Well, we will sometime. But the bass amps are cool because, again, vacuum tubes, blah, blah, blah. And one of the keys for you techno nerds out there is no negative feedback. Negative feedback is an amplifying process where a portion of the signal is taken off, usually the speaker output. It's inverted phase and re-injected back into the signal someplace, and it works like a miracle to reduce distortion. That would be distortion of a steady state, like a sine wave, which is how everything is measured and calibrated, and the specs are derived. The trouble with in my mind, with negative feedback is that the distortion has to occur before the negative feedback can be sent back in to cancel it. So a steady state signal, like a sine wave, that's the same thing, just going on a note, works like a charm. Otherwise, my statement is negative feedback. It's like a cheap perfume on a streetwalker that's used to hide a multitude of sins. A good amplifier needs little or no negative feedback, and in the MI, music instrument category, the key to one of the main keys to our bass amps is, unlike every other tube bass amp, ours has no negative feedback. None, zero. And when we were developing this, we were working with a great bass player, a local guy whose name I've forgotten. Probably wouldn't have heard of him anyway. And, the least amount of negative feedback, oh, you just killed it. It was alive before. What was that? And I mean, it was just the tiniest amount. And, oh, there it is. It's alive again. Well, Sir Paul got that. I guess it was pretty addictive. And people have loved the Neil Young, for example. I've heard from my former prune partner and pal, Larry Craig, who I turned Neil on to. I said, "You need Larry to fix your guitars." "Yeah, I fixed your old black here on tour, but I only did it by doing what Larry told me to do." And he said, "How did you do that?" And I said, "You just need to hire Larry." Well, Larry told me that everything that gets recorded in Neil's world is on the Bass 400. Michael Anthony he also heard that. And, his thing was like, man, I go back to my SVT. It sounds like a carefully executed fart by comparison. So what I was looking for in the bass 400 was a combination of pitch, punch, and power. Pitch, so the frequency of the note is clear. Punch, because it's the attack that is the metronome that sets the groove in the band. And power, well, you have to have a certain amount of power to drive a big speaker, especially in those days where there was the stage sound had to work. You didn't have these monster PAs, and you didn't have modeling. You didn't have any of that stuff. It was real. It was real live stuff. So Sir Paul tells the story. He said, "Yeah, well, I have several people, especially in England, that come to me with their amp. So would you try our amp? Would you try our amp?" Well, yeah. And I tried them. I said, "That's lovely. That sounds very good. Now let's compare it to my Boogie." And he said, everybody goes, "Oh, okay. Sorry. See you later." Well, somehow, and I thank you, Sir Paul, for this, the wing stage was nothing but Mesa Boogies, just from one end to the other. In fact, I have a photo. I think it was in their program. I think there were 32 Mesa Boogie logos on stage in that. And I couldn't have been more proud. The other thing that I was really pleased was that they got 3 full sets of everything. Spares for the spares, as Pete Townsend told me. And never so much as changed a tube in the first set. And part of the agreement was, well, sure, you can return the unused stuff. You don't really need 3 sets. So they returned 1 set. Wow. Now, again, Paul has a great touch. That's part of it. And man, I mean, I remember when we were playing in our struggling little band, it's like, listen to that bass player, man. How can that guy sing so well and play such great bass lines and do them simultaneously live? Well, it's called raw talent and a lot of time spent perfecting your art. After Wings, geez, who knows? The guy that looks after Keith's equipment, and I think he's a personal buddy, is a fellow named Keith Smith. And again, another more down-to-earth, legitimate, sweet, reliable, likable guy you couldn't find. But well, that makes sense. Why, who do you think Paul's going to have hanging around with him other than the best? And so Keith has made several forays to the Mesa Boogie factory and, pleasant times hanging around up in the Tone Lounge, sharing stories and just listening and hanging out and so forth. But some of the tours in the last several years got the opportunity with our man Steve Mueller out of Dallas to go hang out before the show. And he tells a great story. Now, you got to picture Steve, one of the sweetest guys, talented and just a wonderful guy, and a huge Beatles fan. And he said, "Man, there I am. I'm hanging out with Paul prior to the show, and we're talking about bass amps. And Paul he's all in." And the guy comes up and says, "Paul, we need to start the show." Yeah. Give me a few more minutes. And they keep talking. "Excuse me, Paul, the show." Yeah, I'm busy right now. And Steve said, I think the show was 20 minutes late starting because he and Paul were really enjoying each other. And again, Paul, he takes the time to actually talk to this guy. Well, we've had this relationship ongoing for a long, long time, decades, in fact. And one thing that Keith said, one thing that Sir Paul really appreciates, you guys have never, ever asked for anything. Never a photo, never an endorsement, nothing. And that really measures highly in his esteem. And it's like, great, I love it. I mean, the satisfaction, the gratification is already there. So Teresa and I finally did get an opportunity to go meet Paul and hang out before the show, well before the show, listen to the sound check, which was basically the performance. It was incredible. It was at a stadium in San Jose, which is, about 40 miles south of San Francisco. Mesa Boogie is about 40 miles north of San Francisco, so it was in our neighborhood. And again, no expectations. And Keith said, well, it's up to Paul if he's real busy or not in the mood. But he was, and he saw us and he came over. And again, you just couldn't be more charming. Such a gentleman. I mean, my friend compared him to the Dalai Lama. And maybe in spiritual terms and worldwide recognition, that may not be so far off. So we had a lovely conversation, talked about history, and I think I mentioned in an earlier one of these Ramble Fests about Pioneer Town, this funky little western town built for movie making in 1946, just 45 minutes drive from Palm Springs, where I had that house designed and built by the Frank Lloyd Wright disciple. And there is that great, great honky-tonk Pappy and Harriet's Pioneer Town Palace, which Paul played. I wasn't there, unfortunately. We were up north at that time, but apparently it was kind of a fiasco because there were 3,000 people that showed up and the capacity was 300 and the roads were blocked. Nevertheless, talking to Paul about that area, and again, he sort of drifted off in his memory saying, yeah, mate, there is something spiritual going on out there. And I said, yeah, I know. I can't really describe it, but something about that high desert, it's what Joshua Tree is and is like. And this is just part of it. Anyway, the other thing is, after we were chatting and Paul told me how much he actually enjoyed soldering, he called it soldering. I offered him a line job at Mesa Boogie. I said, maybe you can get our Camfashe Fomata, who was the lady that wired amp panels until she retired, front panels. So only for 36, 37 years, she wired every front panel, or her co-worker, KO. She can be tough. And I warned Paul, I said, man, you have to have your chops really up there. She's going to bust you. And he got a big laugh out of that. And then he asked us if we were hungry. Well, matter of fact, we are. And he said, well, come this way. Hey, vegan, you all know that Paul is vegan, but man, don't let your prior prejudice cloud your thinking, because you looked at the food was indescribably delicious and beautiful, and including, he pointed out, he said, well, we have a lot of truckers and they like bangers and mash, bangers being sausage, mash being potatoes. Well, everything was made out of vegan, non-animal products, and yet it looked like the real thing. Shrimp that wasn't shrimp but tasted better than shrimp. Chicken, same thing. The sausages, oh man. And as if that wasn't enough, then the dessert table was just groaning. Man, you could have opened a bakery from what was there. Again, just spectacularly delicious food. Now, one thing I didn't see that I'd heard of is that Paul has an ambiance facilitator who goes in before he arrives and takes one of the best dressing rooms and outfits it like a tent in Scheherazade with, exotic hangings and so forth. Because I mentioned earlier, man, you get into the catacombs underneath some of these giant coliseums and it's anything but aesthetic. And when you're at Sir Paul's level, you want to go in there and feel like, yeah, man, okay, this is comforting and I can relax and get my Zen groove together before going out and putting on a show, which, as you know, his fortitude and stamina is shocking. The guy can go for 2 hours singing every song, playing every song on guitar and or bass. Meanwhile, the sidemen are some cases they're dying. They're getting water. They're falling over. I mean, not terribly. And it was interesting with my dear sweet Teresa. One of the sidemen, I wish I could remember their names now. One was Lyle Workman. The other guy, I can't remember his name, but she and he were friends back from the old days. And the drummer was Abe Laboriel's son, another great character. So, oh man, it was terrific. Now, when I talked about Paul's Zen state, I'm making an assumption there that that's how he preps himself. That's how I used to prep myself before racing. I would lie down in our trailer on some Zen mats, as Thomas called them, and I would picture in my mind what's going to happen on turn one, because that's where the chaos really begins. And there's usually somebody, not usually, but often somebody with a red mist who's going to overcook it and blow it. The tires aren't warmed up. The cars are all jammed really closely together. And what I would do is picture in my mind every possibility. Okay, the guy on and often I'd be at the front, either on the pole or close to it. And I'd be thinking, well, what about that guy behind me? That guy's kind of sketchy, and that car can really accelerate. So what if that guy jumped the start? And my God, that would happen. And so when the race, they throw the green flag and everybody goes hauling up into turn one, and it's chaos about to ensue. And I've pictured a half a dozen scenarios, and it was like, oh, yes, okay, I know this one. This is number 4. That guy goes here, that guy goes there, I'm going to go here. And I just like to think that to be able to do what Paul does, not only that he's a genius and he's been doing it for however long, 60 years, 70, I don't know, that he has to tune himself up mentally, and that's part of why he would have this ambiance, because, and yet he took the time to hang out with us. And by the way, we went on stage prior to, or maybe it was after the sound check. I don't know. Sound check was like an hour long, and it was a show, really. And man, the bass tone with that Hofner bass and the all tube stuff, it was so woody. It sounded phenomenal. It made me proud and happy, and so lucky to have swerved in my life to all of this. I would have never planned it, particularly when my girlfriends in high school were squealing about these bands, this guys from England, the Beatles, and then I'm some kind of jazz snob for the only reason that my dad taught me jazz before rock and roll existed. In fact, I remember my sister, 5 years older than me, her first album was Tennessee Ernie Ford, 16 Tons. And then later, 6 months or a year later, it was Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock, which you could definitely say that was the first rock and roll song. Hey, I don't know where we're going with this, but if you're with me so far, I thank you, and I love the comments, and ramble on. See ya.